Welcome to the Brookdale Writing Series. I'm Roseanne Alvarez, coordinator of the Women's Studies program and an English professor here, and a big fan of the Visiting Writer Series. I have the incredible pleasure to be with poet, writer, teacher, father, Sean Singer, who will be reading tonight at our first Visiting Writer Series of the semester, and who's also a friend, which is so great to be here with you. Sean won the 2001 Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize for Discography, and was also awarded the Norma Faber First Book Award from the Poetry Society of America for Discography. And in terms of critical acclaim and work that's been considered, this book really just brought so much in terms of a kind of radical approach to poetry regarding form and content, its relation to music and history. I was just reading so much of this great stuff that I want to jump in with you and talk about, but I also know you, and I also know that there's more to the idea of discography in you. You are actually a collector of music, and you have a vast collection of music. And so I wondered if you wanted to start and talk about music in your life, because there's a lot of it.
Sure. Nice to see you.
It's great to see you.
Yeah, I have a big collection of jazz albums, we used to call it. But now the CDs have gotten to be out of hand, so I switched to MP3s mostly.
Now, when you say out of hand, how many is that?
I forget how many. Many thousands.
Many thousands of CDs. And this is jazz and blues?
Mostly jazz and some acoustic blues from like the 20s until maybe the 40s.
The reason why I wanted to start off with this is we were talking, and you had said that collecting is an illness. There's something about collecting. But it's also the particular types of music and the format that you collect, and the fact that music is so essential to who you are that you work with it in terms of content, and you work through it in terms of form. And in so many ways, that's what discography explores. So do you listen to music?
I listen all the time.
All the time.
So it's not just to be acquisitive. The obsession extends to almost ritualistic fascination. So it's reading the liner notes. You've got to do that. Listening, and also knowing just from a few bars what you're listening to. It's to identify it.
When you're reading the liner notes, and when you're getting that, like, the full texture, the full sense, right? Because I'm thinking about that. Do you feel that there's something that's lost? Just curious, because you were a collector of CDs, right? And that whole idea of the texture, the liner notes. Do you feel that something is lost now that it's digital?
I think probably the sound quality varies. I mean, certainly there are fanatical people who are audiophiles who have their chair bolted in the floor in a certain position in the room, and they have to have the cat leave the room so the sound doesn't echo off the cat. A literal cat, not the jazz cat. But I think what is probably you do lose I mean, I used to love browsing record stores, flipping through the bins and stuff, and now I don't really do that anymore.
But music is always a part of you and what you do, and when you write. There's one thing I encourage my writing students when we're actually workshopping in the classroom, and they're writing. The first time that they realize that they're allowed to keep their iPods in and listen and write at the same time, they're kind of shocked because they're not used to that idea. But it's what they would do normally, I know, right? And I know it's something that you do in terms of your writing style. So you listen to music when you're writing, when you're doing pretty much everything, except for when your daughter tells you to turn it down so she can watch her shows, right?
Yeah. Or she'll tell me to turn it off so she can dance. Or
Oh, that's awesome. Now, what were you listening to? What were some of the things that you were listening to when you were working on the different pieces in Discography? What was, or?
It's hard for me to remember what.
But was it deliberate in terms of what you wanted to listen to when you're working on some of these poems?
I'm listening for different types of rhythm that are sort of on top of each other. And trying to figure out ways to appropriate those rhythms in language, which is sort of contradictory, because you can't really write about music to recreate it. So you've got to somehow use language in a way that is musical, that does more than just describe the music, because you can't really describe the music without listening. You see the problem?
Right. And so, keeping all that in mind, if someone goes to the reading tonight and wants to get into Discography, how would you, in terms of giving a summary, because we had this conversation where if someone says, would you describe this poem for me, you end up describing it in worse language and thus killing the whole idea of that relationship in the poem. But in terms of now these poems being collected, right, in this, what do you think is part of that? What links them in terms of content and form? What are some of these connections that you made as a writer putting this together?
I made those. I found those threads or those connections after they were written.
Right.
In other words, they were imposed after the fact, after they were written, from above, even years after they were written.
And
so,
yeah, I remember reading something on your point on form and why and when to decide the formal conventions of a poem. And you said, unlike Emerson, who believed that there was this form that was pre-imposed, imposed on a piece, that form and that comes through the content and vice versa, right? And
ideally, there would be some kind of organic relationship so that the form follows from the content. So, for example, in the old record that you were talking about before, the language is sort of spread out across the paper. It's not left margin aligned. So it's supposed to create the sensation of a physical record actually spinning.
Right.
So it's not a circle, but it's in constant motion. And then there's an exclamation mark towards the end that functions almost as the stylus of the needle of the record, that then when it comes down, the song plays immediately after that.
And we move from that to poems. Well, you have a Coltrane poem, right? Right? And you move from poems that take us through place and through space and kind of shift to, I think, explorations of your own personal history and identity in a way. I found that really unexpected when I first read this, that kind of, because that link between music and then a history that seems almost outside of jazz history, right? And how you're bringing those together. So I was wondering if you talk about that.
I don't. They fit together partly because they are together.
Right.
So the juxtaposition really is in itself creating connections that are not really there. They're there because they function as a metaphor where two unrelated things are connected through the language. Mm-hmm. So you get a certain pleasure from ulteriority through that juxtaposition. And I think Ellington also said something like, jazz is about being joyful in spite of conditions. So from the point of view of poems that are about outsider figures or people on the margins or people who feel disconnected from the group,
right,
the jazz somehow connects those voices through the musicality of the language to make a kind of bridge between these different moments in history. And in fact, you can't discuss jazz without discussing race, class, the urban environment, and systems that are applied to explain those phenomenon. So you can't discuss jazz without discussing civil rights, for example.
Right.
You can, but that's not the whole story. For example, if we lived in a free and equal society, Fletcher Henderson wouldn't have become a pianist and a band leader. He would have become a chemistry professor. But his choices were limited in those times, circa 1890, say, till the early 20s. And he didn't become a chemistry professor.
Well, what I want to do is I want to keep talking about this, but I know that we're coming up for a break soon. So I just want to say I'm Roseanne Alvarez here for the Visiting Writers Series with Sean Singer. We're talking about his award-winning poetry collection, Discography, and we're also just talking about poetry, history, and hopefully we'll get into some issues on teaching that I'd be interested in talking about. And we'll be right back.
Hello, my name is Max Weinberg, and I'm a musician, but most importantly, I'm a parent. I'd like to speak to you today about a subject that's very important to me, and I know, of course, that it's important to you, our children. To best understand the challenges that our children face every day, well, I'm going to ask you to go back in time and remember the challenges that you faced as a child. How did you handle the bully in the locker room? How did you handle being left out of the group in the cafeteria? Do you remember who first tried to get you to smoke a cigarette, or try a beer, or a joint? How did you handle peer pressure? These are just a few of the challenges that your child faces every day in their young lives. How did you know what the right choice was? Prevention First is a nonprofit agency in Monmouth County that offers educational programs dedicated to strengthening the foundation of our children's lives.
Open a book, you can explore new lands, meet new friends, and discover new adventures. There are amazing possibilities when you open your mind to reading. You can log onto the Library of Congress website and let the journey begin.
Hi, and welcome back to Brookdale's Writing Series. I'm Roseanne Alvarez, here today with Sean Singer, and we're talking about his poetry collection, Discography, and we're also talking about poetry and lots of things in general. He'll be reading tonight at the first writing series of the semester, and I wanted to know, what are some of the things that you think you'll be reading for tonight? What are some of the poems? What are some of the newer things that you're working on that you'd be interested in reading? Or I know I'm putting you on the spot because you probably haven't decided.
I haven't totally decided what I'm going to read, but hopefully things that from the newer or more recent work that I've been doing since 2002,
Right.
And maybe some from this also.
So, what are some of the changes that you found in what you're exploring in your poetry? What are some of the new subjects or new forms that you're working through?
I've been interested in longer lines, almost. How long can the line be before it, and still be lyrical and still be musical? And I'm also interested in speakers that are really absent from the poem. So in that sense, they're almost anti-lyrical, even though they're also very musical.
Right.
The main difference between poetry and prose is that poetry is written in lines, and it has specific line breaks, whereas prose doesn't. It just goes to the end of the page. So the line is almost like one of those collapsible telescopes where you have to it keeps coming out until you have to almost prop it up with your arm.
Right.
The line is sort of like that. And it approaches the edge almost like prose, but it's obviously not prose. So, for example, I have a long, almost 8 or 10 page poem about the whaling industry in the 19th century that does use very long lines. The men, mostly from Nantucket, which at that time, the mid-19th century, or the early 19th century, had like 7,000 people. The men would go off and hunt whales for 2 or 3 years. So the women, because they were Quakers, they were more egalitarian, they ran the society. Meanwhile, the sperm whales that they were hunting, the bull whales would hunt food, squid, and the female whales would raise the calves in large groups. So, in other words, the human society and the whale society had the same dynamic of gender. So that started me thinking there should be something written about this. Plus, they were ostensibly nonviolent, but the whales were as sophisticated in some ways as human beings. And in some ways, they were more sophisticated. So the fact that they were killing them, it was complete brutality, first of all. Moby Dick describes this in great detail. But in addition to that, they were hunting them for several important things. Light, because they burned the oil that was inside their heads. There were no light bulbs yet. Edison hadn't done that. That was also in New Jersey, by the way.
Yeah.
Perfume, because there's a certain substance in the whale's stomachs called ambergris that had a very pleasant smell. And soap. They made soap out of the substance that was inside the heads also.
And this is something that I wanted to talk about, and I really want to think about that idea of the line and what you're doing with the line and how that kind of helps you think or define the line between poetry and prose. We were talking about this earlier, and I had said to you that you are helping me kind of get a better, to me, you've redeemed like social networking, like Facebook, for example, because what you do with that particular line, the status report, listening to you talk about this, the way you take history and historical fact and what you do with it, you do that in your poetry, right? The poetry that's, published in quote unquote legitimate spaces for poetry, journals, magazines, publications, books, but you do that on social networking sites. And I think in a way you're not only reaching different audiences, but you're also kind of extending that line in terms of poetic form in a way, because your status reports are not, I'm tired, right? They're these tidbits of history, of information, and you're posting up poetry, you're posting up your own. So in so many ways, you're playing with that whole idea of social networking. I wonder if you ever thought about how you're bringing poetry to a different space, or what you're doing with that.
I hadn't thought about it really that much when I was posting those things, but I guess it's true in a certain way that happens.
Yeah, because you have to think about what the dominant discourse, like what most people are posting as their status, right? This is what I'm doing, and instead, you would give us, a historical fact of, this would be used for perfume, right?
Well, it's interesting that poems deal with facts, which is something that was done or something that was said. Mm-hmm. That's what we mean by fact.
Right.
But they also deal with subterfuge or lies that somehow create a larger truth. So seemingly that's a contradiction, that you're lying to somehow tell a greater truth that doesn't use facts, or that uses facts in somehow not duplicitous is too strong a word, but in some reconfiguration of factual data. Like this fact that I mentioned a minute ago about the gender and the whale groups, mm-hmm. and among the hunters of the whales. What do you do with that information? What does that even mean? But yet there's some truth to that that's a little more unsettling than the fact itself tells you. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
And so what is the best line of a poem? It's whatever line you're reading should be the best line. But to have that standard, you really got to focus on the first word of the line, the second word of the line, the third word, and so on.
Right.
And I think some people write that way. They really focus on the line itself.
I know that we're running short of time, and I was listening to you and thinking about writing and the line and history and that idea of, conceit or deceit. And one thing that I had read that in your advice to young writers, you said, read a lot, and read a lot of different things. And I thought, yeah, that's great. And so I was wondering if we could end today just kind of thinking either about that advice or what it means, or what it's like to actually teach this. How do you build that idea of reading into your classes, your curriculum?
I think, first of all, creative writing can be taught. Mm-hmm. There's not agreement about that, even to begin with, but I think that it can. Secondly, I think the purpose of a workshop really is to create better readers, not necessarily better writers. But you can learn how to read from writing. By practicing writing, you can learn how to read better, and from practicing reading, of course, you can learn how to write better. That's for sure. So the best thing to do is just to read as much as possible. Try to show in your writing what you've read. And when you're reading, try to play the stunt double for the writer and try to understand the choices that the writer made. Were those the right choices or the wrong choices? Mm-hmm. And similarly, when you're writing, you've got to play the double for the reader and try to anticipate what understandings or meanings or judgments the reader will get from your writing.
And that playing the double, that all speaks of the relationship you see between the reader and the poem in creating the text, in creating the meaning.
Yeah, the meaning of the best poems is created by the writer and the reader. So it's a very intimate relationship that, say, I have with Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman, that even though they're long gone, still the breath from my lungs mm-hmm. and my physical body in 2009
right.
is connected to them in the past. So that is a very intimate relationship that's not like the other arts. You know, when you go to a dance, you don't get up and start dancing. When you go to see a painting, you're just sort of passively observing the painting. You're not. But a poem is not that way. The poem, in other words, is created in the moment from a person's imagination from the past and the present reader's body, because the body is an amplifier. So it really only exists from that. So that in itself makes it different from other art forms. That's very interesting.
Well, thank you so much, Sean, for coming and talking with me
Thank you.
today. This has been the Brookdale Writer Series, and I'm Roseanne Alvarez, and we just had a great conversation here with Sean Singer. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing you and connecting with you tonight with the poems that you will choose to read for us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.